Welcome to The Coaching Corner, a podcast for coaches coaching in the child welfare field. I'm your host, James Coloma, and on today's episode, we'll be talking about mapping with families. We'll hopefully get an overview of what a map is. We'll talk about the little details of what goes into a map, like a genogram, and we'll spend some time talking about what questions we could use when we're looking at mapping with families. In a moment, Bill James will join us on today's episode to help us understand more about this topic. I'm James Coloma, and we'll be right back. Hi, Bill.
Hi, James.
Welcome to our podcast today.
I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you. So tell us a little about yourself, something new.
I said before, started working with adolescents in residential treatment back in 1989 and started working for the County of San Diego in 1994. In the last 13 years of supervising staff for the County of San Diego, the safety organized practice rollout showed up in San Diego about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was very fortunate and privileged to be part of that first cohort of trainers for San Diego County. And I just have been really impressed and really astounded by the results that some of my staff had by sitting down and doing mappings over the last few years, really with families in their homes. In some situations, radically changing the direction of the case so the kids could go home safely, and finding new things out about families that we just didn't even realize was there in terms of strength. So I'm really excited about today's topic.
And I'm excited to learn about mapping. So do you happen to know what the history of mapping is?
So as this model developed in Australia, really followed the concept of solution-focused brief therapy. And the guiding principle there is what people pay attention to is what grows. What gets the most attention, both emotionally and mentally, intellectually, tends to be rich territory to mine and look for. And they discovered that if they spent more time asking what's working well in a family and collaboratively asking what needs to happen next, that they were able to get a better picture of things that family could do to keep a child safe and how to get there. So it's really a graphic representation of solution-focused interviewing.
So that is what a map is, then. It is a graphical representation using solution-focused interviewing to lay out what the family looks like.
Well, there's a couple of pieces of it. We start with mapping out, doing a little genogram about what the family's relationships are in a multi-generational way, I guess you could say. And we use that same part of the map to talk about cultural issues, socioeconomic issues, the context that the family finds themselves in. Usually, stuff that they don't have any control over. It's where they live and who their parents are and where their grandparents are and stuff like that. And then there's usually another sheet of paper. Lots of different people have different ways that they construct this. Some people put it into 4 quadrants. Other people put them in 3 columns with a scale across the bottom. But the essential, the form is not important. I just want to make sure that people realize that there's a variety of ways that people can graphically represent things that are going on for the family. But the important thing is getting it out of our heads and onto paper and having the parents side by side with us and anybody else in the network that's going to help us accomplish those goals, so that we're all looking at it. We are all creating something like a map.
Okay. So you mentioned 4 quadrants and a 3-column map, but you also mentioned that the structure may not be important. It's the information that we gather when we're making the map, which is the important part of this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what we're trying to do is put as much emphasis on what is working well for this family. What are their acts of protection? What are their strengths? And what are some things that we could build on the capacity so that they could be more protective? And that's an important part of the map. It's either one side of the 4 quadrants, or it's a whole column of the 3 columns that we draw in the 3-column map.
Okay. So what do I need to do to get started? What do I need to do to prepare for my first mapping session?
So I'm going to assume that you've attended one of the modules, one of the training sessions about what maps look like. And so you're probably going to already know the outline. It's also quite helpful to cut your teeth, so to speak, by doing some mappings with coworkers in the office. Get some feedback from someone who's a little more experienced about, hey, remember to do the context. If you're not sure how to do the genogram symbols, have a cheat sheet with you. Get some feedback about writing things in behavioral detail as opposed to jargon when you're doing your map. I would do some of that stuff in the office because that's a good place to sort of get oriented. Having said that, though, one of my first really success stories with having a staff person do a map with a family involved much less preparation than that. And I wish I could take credit for this, but I have to say that one of my peers, another supervisor who was also a safety organized practice trainer, was in the office on a day that I wasn't. And she said my worker was very much concerned about what was going on. And she said, look, just take a piece of paper, divide it into 3 columns, and go have a conversation with the family. And literally, that was my first. When I came back to the office a couple of days later, this worker was very excited because just by separating things out on the sheet of paper and having people help her fill in the 3 columns about what are we worried about, what is working well, and what needs to happen next, it just made it a more balanced conversation. So if you have time to prepare in the office to get a little bit accustomed to it, fine. If you do it a little bit on the fly, you're probably going to be okay too.
The questions, the 3 questions that you asked, is that the basic structure of a map?
That is the basic structure of the map, as long as you include getting the context in advance. So I guess there's really 4 questions. There's, where's this family at, where they're coming from, and who's in it. Then on a 3-column map, we usually put what's working, or what are we worried about on the left column, what's working well in the middle column, and what needs to happen next in the far right column. And then a scale across the bottom, 10 being safe, 0 being not so safe. I normally start the conversation with the middle column, though, if I'm sitting down with a family. I start with what's working well so far for this family. Then if you want to go into what's on the 4 column, we can do that too.
Okay. So in the middle column is what's working well, and then what's on the left-hand side, is that what are we worried about?
That's what we're worried about, and that's where we would put things like harm statements or danger statements and complicating factors. Now, you don't really worry about those distinctions at the beginning of the mapping session. You really just capture things that people are worried about without a lot of filter. And then near the end of the mapping process, you think through with the family which of these things actually poses a risk or danger to the children versus, like the broken down car is maybe just a complicating factor.
Okay. So if that's a 3-column map, what's a 4-quadrant map?
The 4-quadrant map is really just what's working well on one side, what are we worried about on the other, but you tend to put the acts of protection near the top in the upper left corner and the harm and danger in the upper right corner, and then all of the strengths in the quadrant below acts of protection and complicating factors in that quadrant that's underneath harm and danger. And then you make a separate space, maybe a different piece of paper or something across the bottom to talk about what needs to happen next.
So it sounds to me like these maps help us to organize and group our thinking and our thoughts around this family.
It definitely helps. It helps organize the thinking. I believe that the initial benefit, though, is that there's a whole column that's blank where the what's working well needs to be filled in. And so because part of the task is to fill in that column with what's working well, it prompts all of us to focus on that a little bit longer and in a little bit more depth than we normally give it credit.
How do we ask questions then using our maps? You talked about the 3 questions, but what are other questions to use?
There are questions. You can use any of the solution-focused interviewing questions. You certainly, in terms of what's working well, if the family is facing challenges or has faced challenges in the past, you're going to ask them coping questions like, how did you get through that? What helped you be successful in overcoming, some past obstacle? Very important question is who was around to help you and support you, or who would you call if you had an emergency and you needed help, at 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that? What are some things that you're really proud of as a family? What are some of the high points in your family's life that we would like to record as some of the things that have worked well for you in the past, even if they're not currently issues? So those are some of the kinds of questions that I ask about in the what's working well. I also, in the what are we worried about? What's your understanding of why the child welfare worker came and knocked on your door in the first place? What do you think the judge's understanding is of why we had to be involved in your family's life? What do you think you could do that would prove to the judge that your kids could be home with you and safe? That can go into the what needs to happen next question. So I use a lot of position questions. And near the end, I start to use that scale across the bottom, especially if a family and I are in agreement with a lot of what's on that map so far, then I start to ask them, 10 being perfectly safe, 0 being unsafe and needing to be removed, where do you think your kids would be? Where do you think the judge would put that number? Where do you think minor's attorney would put that number? Where do you think your kids would put that number? And this is a way to get parents outside of their own head, outside of their own perspective, and thinking about different perspectives as they think about that map.
How do we use trauma to inform this practice?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, I think one of the things that I struggled with in the past around all the trauma-informed trainings that the county hired people to come do for us was that all sounded really good, and I understand I don't want to be a source of trauma in the life of a family, and I want to try to make decisions that are trauma-informed. The nice thing about mapping is this is a concrete way to practice in a trauma-informed way. simply by sitting down and asking the questions about what's working well is a way to reduce anxiety, reduce the pain and insult and injury of having your children, removed from your care or having the agency involved. And it invites the parents, gives them an opportunity to tell more of their story. And those are all things that the research on trauma-informed practice says that we need to do. Reduce the anxiety of the clients that we're working with, help them find internal strengths that they can bring to bear on the situation, help them find network and external sources of support, and give them a chance to tell their story about and that's part of why that context and the genogram is so important. That's an opportunity for the family to explain to you, that they're living in a difficult situation, that they came from a difficult situation, what was going on in the generation or before them or the generation before that was traumatic for them. All of those things are part of trauma-informed practice. So this is a structured way to bring that to your casework.
So all of this sounds wonderful, but it strikes me that this is going to take some time. You talked about we first need to start with context, and then we go into looking at what's working well, what are we worried about, what needs to happen next. We have a scaling question at the end, and while we're doing all this, we're always making sure that we're attuning to trauma, or making sure that our decisions are trauma-informed. So that's a lot of things to do. How long does this typically last?
So that's a really good question, and I'll answer it two ways. First, anytime you're learning a new skill, you might be a little bit slower at it than So the first two or three, maybe 4 times that I facilitated a mapping in the office or with a family, probably took closer to an hour and a half for that process to wind its way through and for us to get to. But so one answer is, as your skill develops, you'll get better at asking powerful questions, and you'll get better at helping the family stay focused on the questions that are important along the way. So your ability to do a mapping will shorten with practice. The other thing that's true is the first time you're sitting down with a family, they may have a lot to say on any given case, even after you're an expert at running mappings. The first time you sit down with a family, they may need a little more airtime and space. But once they get accustomed to the structure and framework, when you sit down and you're probably going to do it with just the parent at first, and later on you're going to be inviting more members of the network who are there to support the what's going to happen next column in terms of problem solving. So those subsequent mapping sessions with families will get shorter because the parents will already kind of know the gig. They'll know the structure, they'll be more comfortable with it, and they'll understand how to stay focused on the topics that are important. So you may end up going slow in the beginning so that you can make better, more effective, more informed progress in month 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 in a reunification case.
So it's okay if this process takes a while in the beginning because we do get more information, but as I just heard, I think we then are able to have better information to make more informed decisions.
Absolutely. And taking the time to listen to someone's trauma narrative is part of a trauma-informed practice. Trauma-informed practice never promised to be quick and easy.
Mm-hmm.
Good comprehensive assessments do take time early in a case. There's just no two ways about it.
Who should be involved when making a map? I heard you say the family should be there and then the network should also be involved. But let's highlight who should be involved.
So first of all, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing a map in the office between just you and your supervisor and maybe a couple of peers as a case review tool. I have seen very powerful and positive results from doing that in terms of just workers and supervisors becoming more clear about the issues. The first time or two that you sit down to have these conversations with families, the parents may just want it to be them and you, for starters. Part of safety organized practice in general, though, is including the voice of the child. So fairly early in month 2 or 3, you're going to be asking, as age appropriate, for the children to be participating in the mapping process. And another part of safety organized practice is, in order to develop a plan for safety, you need a network of people who are going to support the family in getting through this process. So as soon as possible, you want to be inviting relatives, extended family, friends, and relationships from church or the neighborhood, the people that are going to be a part of a network that are going to help support the follow-through safety actions. You also want to invite them to the subsequent mappings.
So as a coach, how do I use this information about mapping with people that I'm coaching to?
The mapping process is almost always a good way to organize your own thinking about what's going on a case. And the good news is, as you get more accustomed to it, it becomes more second nature. But you are unlikely to go wrong if, when someone comes in and says, I just want to get clear about where I'm heading with a case, if you frame your questions, and one of my favorite things to do, quite frankly, as a coach, is to get a worker and a supervisor there in the room together, and then I push the paper and the pens or pencils in front of the supervisor, and I ask them to walk us through the mapping process, and I just guide it, make sure that they start with a context and they start with a genogram, and then I get them to ask each other the questions that are important. And often I don't have to do much. They figure a lot of stuff out on their own just by following the mapping process.
It sounds to me that this whole process also takes a lot of resources. In other words, I may need a couple pieces of paper and some pens and different colored pens to help me facilitate this whole thing.
Well, I've never tried different colored pens.
Okay.
I think I would say not really. A few pieces of paper and a crayon, perhaps. Maybe
okay.
a pen or pencil instead, if you want it to be a little bit neater. I think that's one of the nice things is you can do it on the back of a napkin. Really, if you get to somebody's house, they probably have some junk mail laying around that you could draw on the back of. It's really the mental structure of moving them through the process that's important. I like to have a lot of scrap paper around just because I want to encourage people to write things down instead of trying to keep it up here.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good point. And thank you for highlighting the fact that you could do this basically anywhere with very few things, or with a whole bunch of supplies if you needed to.
Yeah, I think people, at least in my home county, because team decision-making meetings have been around for so long, I think there's an expectation that you're going to have flip charts and they're going to be up on the wall, or that you're going to have one of those fancy whiteboards, stuff like that. You don't need that stuff. What you really need is the structure of the questions in the interview process. And you're not, if you want to be casual when you sit down with families, you don't want to be super rigid. You want to give them a chance to express themselves in a comfortable way. And so usually that's just sheets of paper on the kitchen table.
I think you highlighted then the importance of a map. It's not necessarily the product of making the map, but it's the ability for us to use the structure to gather information from the family.
Yes. Yeah, that really, and even the format is not as important as the sequence of the questions, and remembering to help them separate out what is actually dangerous, harmful or dangerous to their kids versus stuff that, we recognize could be a problem for them, but we're not going to hold it against them in terms of complicating factors. We just need to wrestle with those and deal with them as best we can. And then over on the strength side, there could be a lot of things that they're happy with their lives and that they think that they deserve credit for, and we want to give them credit for. But they have to bump it up to acts of protection in order to actually demonstrate to the agency and the judge and to their kids that their kids are going to be safe. I think that distinction at the end is very important.
So say one more time what that distinction was.
So you're going to have a long list of things in the what's working well column. You're going to have a long list of things in the what are we worried about column. And so kind of the final stage of the mapping process is helping people distinguish between what's a credible threat of danger to their children versus complicating factors. Corporal punishment with a belt or a piece of wood or some other instrument, that's a credible source of danger that could damage a child's body, right? The fact that the car is broken down and they can't get it fixed until next week is not a threat of danger to the kids. That's just a complicating factor that makes life difficult, whether it's getting to services, stuff like that. On the other side, we want to know that, dad's employed full-time, that the grandparents come and do babysitting occasionally to help relieve stress. All of those things, those can go in the what's working well column. But in every single case, you have to distinguish which of those things are really going to protect the children from harm or injury and which things are, it's a good thing that I'm employed full-time, but that doesn't have really much impact on how well I treat my kids.
Okay. Any closing thoughts about mapping with families?
My biggest closing thought is just do it. Take some scrap paper or look for some, junk mail that they haven't thrown away yet. Grab a crayon and ask the questions. Where does your family come from? What does your family look like? Who all is in it? What are some challenges that you face, in terms of the context of where your family of origin comes from? And then start asking, fill in a column of what's working well, what are we worried about, what needs to happen next. And you will be amazed at the amount of rich information that comes out of that process.
That sounds great. Well, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today, Bill.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Thank you. We'll be right back. You've been listening to The Coaching Corner from the Public Child Welfare Training Academy Radio through the Academy for Professional Excellence at San Diego State University School of Social Work. For more information about the Academy for Professional Excellence and the services we offer, please visit us on the web at theacademy.sdsu.edu. You can also subscribe to the Academy for Professional Excellence's YouTube channel by searching for the Academy SDSU. If you want to map this episode for us and let us know what went well for this episode, what you're worried about what we talked about, or for what additional topics we should do a podcast on, drop us a line at jcoloma@mail.sdsu.edu, and in the subject line, please reference the title of this podcast. A special thank you to our guest today, Bill James. Please join us next time as we explore other topics in the child welfare arena. I'm your host, James Coloma, and now go out there and inspire and innovate our child welfare field.